Thank you very much for the invitation, and it was extremely interesting to hear all of the reports about the activity that's going on, which I think is just a snapshot of work that is going on across the country in support of the Palestinians, which I think is extremely impressive. The book which I wrote was a consequence of research that I did over 6 or 8 years for a PhD, which I completed last year, and I sent it off to a number of publishers and got 3 offers, so I was very pleased with that. And it wasn't written intentionally because this year is the anniversary of Balfour, but it was written motivated by a number of reasons, really, related to the way in which I felt that the Palestinian case was being presented and the way in which the Balfour Declaration itself was being represented. And to some extent I have to feel that I sense this in certain aspects of the way in which the film presented the story, but I hope that rather than kind of direct my remarks about the film, you'll see coming out of my talk that how my vision, if you like, of the Balfour Declaration so on differs. And it arises from 3 kind of central questions revolving around the 3 central groups of people, if you like, involved in this. One is the British themselves and how they were deciding upon the issue of making the Balfour Declaration, their attitude towards Zionism and so on. The second, and it was a belief essentially that I do not believe that the British ever do anything out of altruism. I think one has to have a profound suspicion of any international intervention which the British make, and I shall list the most recent evidences of that. The second was a feeling of criticism about the way in which Zionism was presented as somehow a monolithic element in relation to the Jewish community, which it most certainly wasn't. And I hope during the course of what I have to say that I'll give you evidence of that. And the third thing, which I think is continuously omitted from many accounts of the whole issue of the Balfour Declaration, and that is the role of the Palestinians themselves. They're presented in some sort of passive way as people who were simply the victims or were the people present in the area without having any independent narrative of what they were actually seeking to achieve and what their objectives and ideas and aspirations were. And I think so that in each of those 3 cases, I think there's an inadequacy about the general narrative. And you see it even when you read things like Ian Black's piece in The Guardian, I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, about the Balfour Declaration, that these sort of myths were, in my view, being replicated by what he had to say and really underpinned some of his comments. I mean, just a couple of throwaway references to that. One was that he talks about Lord Rothschild as being the representative of the Jewish community in Britain, which was a gross distortion of the actuality of what was the case in terms of the Jewish community and Rothschild's position in relation to that. Another one was the way in which, again, he has this reference to the Palestinians in a kind of very passive way. They were simply the people who happened to be there, rather than actually being a people with their own very specific and clear political agenda in respect of what they wanted to achieve and what they wanted to see happen, and the evidence for that is substantial. I think in part this is because in most of the history that's been written, as Abby Schlein once commentated, is written by the victors, and so it's a way in which that story, I think, is recounted. So let's start by having a look first of all at what was the situation at the time. I mean, there's been reference to the First World War, and clearly that was the major event that was taking place. And when you come to look at some of the details of this, about the decisions in relation to Balfour, it's very interesting that they really begin to accelerate only in 1916, 1917, when there is a move towards the signing of the Balfour Declaration. And before that it's been referenced, but only in passing in terms of British strategic interests. But those interests were very, very clear, and they were rebounded around 3 components, if you like. The overwhelmingly dominant one of which was the British preoccupation with maintaining the empire. And this wasn't just kind of some sort of abstract possession of lands outside of Britain, it was that they constituted a material aid to Britain in pursuing the whole war effort. The Indian country, for example, which at that point, of course, incorporated Pakistan and Bangladesh, and wasn't just India as we know it today, provided more than a million soldiers in the First World War. It provided resources which were material to the prosecution of that war, as well, of course, being a major source of wealth for the British and British companies, British ruling class, British Empire. And similarly, East Africa was in a similar position, and they were vital kind of parts of it, as well, of course, as Australia and New Zealand. And in order to maintain those links, the Suez Canal was absolutely critical. More than 50% of the world's vessels at this time were British. So actually having control over the Suez Canal was critical at one end of the Red Sea. At the other end, of course, you know, the British were in Aden, and that was another part of it. The two areas where there were possible pinch points in terms of any ability of the British to maintain their links and their contacts with the rest of the empire. So control over this area, control over the Suez Canal, was a vital part of British interests at this time. And in addition to that, they wanted to maintain the capacity to have a land link. And this was really the original preoccupation of the British, rather more than this, well, not rather more, but in tandem with the Suez Canal. They had a committee called the Bunsen Committee, which was established by the British government around 1913 to look at strategy in terms of the Middle East and what they should do, what kind of steps they should take. Later, Lord Kitchener, wrote a paper which was read in the cabinet called Alexandretta Mesopotamia. Alexandretta was that part of the Mediterranean in the northeast corner between Turkey and Syria, and Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. And he laid out a strategy in terms of how the British should develop a line that would enable them to keep a land bridge across that area of the world in order that they could move, if necessary, reinforcements rapidly to the Indian subcontinent in the event, and this was seen as a really material potential, in the event that the Tsarist Russia decided to expand its area of influence down through Persia and or Afghanistan in order to gain access to the Indian Ocean, to establish an ice-free port in that area of the world. And Russia was seen as a real material threat. It was part of the whole, you know, you've heard the story of the Great Game, as it was sometimes called, in relation to Afghanistan. So these were real issues that the British faced. And in Kitchener's paper, when he wrote about this suggestion about how they should look at this area of influence, and they should ensure that they had some sort of control over it, he made specific reference to the question of oil. Oil was beginning to become an extremely important commodity. It was not just that it was seen in any way on the sort of scale that we know today, but between 1910 and 1920, British importation of oil increased 11-fold, absolutely escalated. And the reason for that was because partly because, for example, in 1912, Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, decided to switch the Royal Navy from being coal-fired vessels to being oil-fired vessels. And in doing that, it increased the efficiency of the Navy by increasing the range of vessels by another 50%, and also reduced the crewing of the vessels from those who were necessary to keep the fires stoked for the coal, with coal for the running of the engines, into being more freely available. So it was an important intervention in terms of the changes in the way in which Royal Navy vessels operated. And what happened as well in the First World War was a massive increase in the use of tanks and motorized vehicles for engagement in the war, and the beginnings, of course, of air warfare, which started in the First World War. So these things were really important changes. You will have heard, or perhaps remember this, not that anybody was there, but you may remember the story of the French general who had a problem on the Western Front and needed to get troops there rapidly. So he commandeered the whole of the Paris taxi fleet to get his troops shifted from one part of the front to another. And that really had an impact because that was replicated elsewhere. So these were, land, sea and oil were really important factors. They were not passing things. And this is why I think that the question of the Balfour Declaration, what happened in Palestine, has to be put in that context. It has to be understood not as something the British wanted to do in respect of Palestine, but something the British were doing in respect of the empire, which this facilitated in their position in terms of their ability to carry forward. And where does the question of Zionism come into this? Well, there is a kind of symmetry, really, and that is this, that from the perspectives of the Zionists, they knew full well that they were unable to achieve their objectives unless they were able to get a major imperial patron for what they wanted to do. So it wasn't just the case that Weizmann came and talked to the British. The Zionist leadership went to every major imperial power. They went to the Kaiser, they went to the president in France, they went to the prime minister in Italy, they went to see the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and they even went to see the Tsarist government. In fact, the person that they engaged in talks with was a man called von Plehve, who was the leader of the Black Hunt, or was behind the anti-Semitic organizations which were carrying out the pogroms in Eastern Europe. So they were looking for someone who would give them some kind of undertaking in respect of ensuring the achievement of their goals. And the British were in a position where they were also looking for excuses, rationalizations, explanations as to why they should actually intervene in this area specifically. And that was because under the Ottoman Empire there existed what were called capitulations or concessions. That is, that those people who belonged to certain faiths were under the patronage of certain imperial powers. So Christians, particularly Catholics for example, were under the protection of France. Those of the Orthodox religion were under the protection of Russia. Britain had no particular locus in respect of saying, well, we're here or we're coming to Palestine because we want to exercise our responsibility in respect of those for whom we have a care. So in a way, Zionism provided, if you like, and again, a useful in which would legitimate how they wish to pursue their actions. Now, of course, what is important to understand in terms of the growth and expansion of Zionism is that it came out of a real need, and one should say this should be recognized, and that is the profound anti-Semitism which existed particularly in Russia and Eastern Europe, with pogroms being carried out, homes and villages and towns being destroyed, people being murdered. In Kishinev, for example, in 1903, more than 50 Jews killed, and in other parts of Russia as well. So I think, you know, one should say that the growth of Zionism, in a sense, was quite understandable. It was a response to an absolute horrific tragedy that was going on. And it came, in a sense, out of a growing political and ideological development which had been going on in Europe throughout the 19th century, and that was the growth of nationalism. France, Italy rather, and Germany, for example, were only constituted as whole nations in the 19th century. Nationalism was spreading throughout Eastern Europe for people fighting for independence from the Ottoman Empire. So the Zionist ideology, the thoughts and ideas which underpin it, in a sense came from that tradition as well, of seeking to look for a national solution to the problem. And it's worth remembering that, and again this is another fault of Ian Black when he says in his article, he said that Balfour was a great hero to the Zionists. Well, he was a hero to the Zionists, but he was not a hero to the Jews. In 1905, Balfour was actually the Prime Minister who in Britain tried to introduce the Aliens Act, which was in order to keep Jews out of Britain. his government passed legislation which was anti-immigrant legislation, which was about the restriction of the number of immigrants coming into Britain, and it particularly targeted Jews from Russia. That was the way in which the de facto outcome of the legislation worked. And I mean, again, just as an interesting aside to look at some of these things, Churchill, who was a young member of Parliament in those days, actually made some very good speeches about this Aliens Act, attacking Balfour, saying that although you could introduce this legislation, who it will hit will be working class Jews, because those people with wealth will be able to circumvent any immigration legislation, immigration restrictions you have, and gain entry into Britain. Now, looking at the Zionists as a whole, in the very beginning they themselves were not united in a perspective of Palestine as the objective that they wished to obtain. There was a majority of the Zionists until 1905, this is between the very end of the 19th century through to 1905, who were called territorialists. They were prepared to have a homeland for the Jews anywhere in the world which could be provided that they would be able to establish some kind of autonomous area. And many offers were made. I mean, there were discussions about Argentina, about Canada, Cyprus, and the most concrete proposal was actually known as the Uganda Project, which was a proposal by the British to give space in East Africa. In actual fact, it was not in Uganda. The reason it was called the Uganda Project was that I think it was Chamberlain or whoever was on the train. It was a Uganda railway train, but it was actually in Kenya, the land which they were proposing. And they talked about offering a piece of land which would have complete internal autonomy, but would be under the hegemony, under the domination of the British, who would be responsible for any external relationships between that area and other parts of the world, and so on. In actual fact, that was turned down, and in 1905, the territorialists were defeated inside the Zionist movement, and it was the majority position was adopted that Palestine should be the only destination which they would accept as the goal. Jumping forward then, just in respect of the debate within Zionism, this remark that I made earlier, that in fact the views of Jews in Britain were very, very differentiated, were by no means homogeneous, I think is really important. In fact, I think there is substantial evidence to suggest that non-Zionist Jews, I won't say anti-Zionist because I'm not sure that can be sustained as an argument, but certainly the majority of Jews were not Zionists. They had a religious aspiration, or it was believed that it would be the case at some point in the future that maybe Jews would return to Palestine, but not as an active political goal that they were campaigning on. And it was reflected in the responses when the British government decided to canvass what the views of the Jewish community was in respect of Palestine, and they wrote to leading members of the Jewish community and asked them what their views were. And a number of them wrote back. There were 10 selected people who were deemed to be kind of the authoritative voices of the Jewish community. And some of them wrote back explicitly stating that the idea of creating a homeland for the Jews was something that they were opposed to. Some of them went so far as saying that in their view, Jews were not a national group. They were a religious group, they were an ethnic group, they were a cultural group, but that they were not a national group, and that they therefore were completely opposed to it. People like, for example, Sir Philip Magnus, who was a member of Parliament, and he said, for example, that certainly there should be acknowledgement that it had a connectivity with Judaism. Palestine should have a connection with Judaism, but not that it should become a national whole. And they were concerned about what would be the implication for that. He said, for example, that it might be interpreted as implying that the government of that country, i.e. Palestine, would under certain conditions be transferred to the Jews. Such a pronouncement would certainly arouse considerable opposition from other Palestinian communities, and might result in the Jews now resident in Palestine being exposed to the same treatment at the hands of at the hands of the Turks, as has been unhappily experienced by Armenian Christians. Now, in actual fact, there were Jews living in Palestine. They were mainly Mizrahi Jews, Jews of Arab nations or from Arabic areas who spoke Arabic, whose culture was not dissimilar, and who certainly, when it came to the 1920s, for example, were completely alienated from Zionism. It wasn't really until the end of the 20s, the 1930s, that changed, and the Jews who lived in Palestine, particularly in Hebron, Jerusalem, and Safed, and one or two other places, were mainly religiously focused in their communities. It wasn't until the tragic massacre took place later in Hebron, particularly, when that changed. Up until that time, they were not Zionists. And inside Palestine itself, the Palestinians spoke inside synagogues, and members of the Jewish community expressed their support for the ideas that the Palestinians were expressing for a united Palestinian nation and for the right of self-determination. But returning back to Britain, there were attempts by sections of, as I said, there were attempts by sections of the Jewish community in Britain to clarify and to express what they wanted to see happen. For example, in 1916, I think it's quite interesting, there was a letter from Lucian Wolff, who was a leading Jewish figure in Britain, to the Foreign Office, who said the following: in the event of Palestine coming within the sphere of influence of Great Britain or France at the close of the war, the government of those powers will not fail to take account of the historic interests that country possesses for the Jewish community. The Jewish population will be secured in the enjoyment of civil and religious liberty, equal political rights with the rest of the population, reasonable facilities for emigration and colonization, and such municipal privileges in the towns and colonies inhabited by them as may be shown to be necessary. In other words, it's saying that it's about the Jews who already live there, their rights being protected in the event of a political construct being put together in Palestine, and that there should be acknowledgement of the links of Judaism with that area, but not talking about the creation of a Jewish state. It's very much envisaged in terms of the rights of people who live in that land. And similar other comments were made which talk about there being a Jewish cultural centre being established, and this was the view of, again, Sir Philip Magnus, who I referred to again, who said, who provided and this was when they were consulting about the Balfour Declaration. This was his alternative to Balfour, written in 1917, beg your pardon, when he said it should read like the following: His Majesty's government views with favour the establishing Palestine, so far the same, the establishment in Palestine of a centre of Jewish culture, and will use its best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Britain, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So not a national home, but a centre of Jewish culture. This was a very influential figure, and in fact the tide of Zionism within the Jewish community, within the leading kind of Jewish bodies like the British Board of Deputies of British Jews, only changed really in 1917 itself, when the Zionists won a majority of 56 to 51 on a technical vote about if you like, a tactical error by the anti-Zionist movement in the way in which it had been pursuing the campaign. So this idea, going back to Black and the Guardian article, for example, that Rothschild represented the Jewish community, I think is an utter and complete myth, which is still, unfortunately, kind of perpetuated. So what of Palestine itself, which I said I think is neglected in the histories of the whole discussion about what was taking place? Well, the Palestinians were aware of the aspirations of Zionism right from early years. Not as many people seem to think that the Palestinians responded in the 1920s when they suddenly became anti-Zionist, or as people tend to try to present it, as anti-Jewish. I don't think they were anti-Jewish, I think they were anti-settlers and anti-colonization. But that was manifested in the fact that those who were colonizing were Jewish. I think if it had been any other colonization, I'm convinced that the Palestinians would have been equally as opposed to what might have happened. And, you know, there's a very simple and silly, not silly, but it might sound flippant, but there is a very simple reason that it wasn't another community, and that was because the British largely colonized the British, from the British perspective, in parts of the world which had a similar climatic character, or was in the same kind of regional zones geographically as Britain itself. They didn't colonize, in other words, largely they didn't colonize kind of countries that were climatically radically different. They used other methods of colonialism, but that's different from colonization. Colonization, when you actually send people to live in a land. Colonialism, when you take control over a land, but you don't necessarily send people to colonize it. And this was a colonizing project which the British were engaged with Zionism. And they didn't have people who wanted to colonize, or British people in Britain who wanted to colonize Palestine. Palestinians were well aware of what was going on. They were quite conscious of what was happening. In 1911, two members of the Parliament of the Ottoman Parliament in Constantinople, representatives from Jerusalem, spoke out explicitly against Zionism. They criticized it. In fact, to be perfectly blunt, the Palestinians had more democracy under the Ottomans than they did under the British. And they spoke out against it. There were newspapers produced widely. There were at least 8 newspapers in the early part of the 20th century, Palestinian newspapers. There were articles written that were produced in newspapers in Cairo, which were syndicated is the wrong word, but they were reproduced in newspapers in other parts of the Arab world. Newspapers published in Beirut, in Haifa, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem, and so on. And it wasn't just in the newspapers. I mean, there is a patronizing kind of view, if you like, that because people are illiterate, or the majority are illiterate, they're not aware of what was going on. This was not true. These newspapers were sent out by the owners to various towns and villages, and were often then in cafes and other public places read out to people, just as happened in factories in various parts of the world where, you know, they had readers who would read the local news and read novels and so on. I mean, very famous in Cuba, the tobacco workers had readers employed who would read the newspapers and would read, you know, Victor Hugo and all sorts of things. And this was true in Palestine. And it was acknowledged in 1922 in a report that was produced by one of the army people in relation to some incidents that occurred, in which he said that actually, you know, politics was the everyday conversation of people in the villages, much more so than in Britain. You know, in other words, the Palestinians were more political than the British because they did know what was going on. And on top of this, in terms of kind of when we talk about Sykes-Picot and the negotiations that British would be engaged in, a big factor in revealing and understanding what was going on. Am I all right? I'm all right. I'm trying to see if eyes are closing or anybody's nodding off, you know, just shout, you know, if you had enough. A big factor in this was the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when they published all of these things. So Izvestia published the Sykes-Picot Agreement and exposed it, and this became quickly known. Even the Manchester Guardian, as it was then, within a week or two of Izvestia publishing it, published it as well. So they knew all these machinations, they knew about it. So this idea you had an uninformed, unengaged, if you like, politically illiterate group of people whose politics was shaped only as a consequence of a response to Zionism is wrong. They continuously, throughout the whole period of the 1920s, were opposed to all sorts of measures that the British tried to bring in to establish legislative councils or bodies that would incorporate them in a process of, if you like, forfeiting their own legitimate demands for self-determination. And it's important to understand, I think, that in respect of the British occupation, I don't like this term that the British, I mean, it's, sorry, but it's said in the film the British were handed the mandate. It's absolute nonsense. They weren't handed the mandate, they occupied Palestine. The mandate was written by the British, just in the same way as very often now we see the United States writing the policies of the United Nations. The British, you have to think of the British in those days in the way in which we think about the Americans today, in terms of their world dominance. Britain was a world power with colossal wealth, you know, and capacity to intervene internationally. So they were not handed the mandate, they wrote the mandate. They wrote it. And the wording of the mandate, and you can read it, was explicitly taken from the Balfour Declaration. It wasn't that it was somehow formulated in some abstract, you know, neutral way. It was actually lifted straight from what the British did. And they took steps to implement their control over Palestine from the very beginning. They appointed High Commissioner Herbert Samuel, who went into place before the League of Nations authorized gave it some authority and some sort of international legitimacy, and before that had even happened. So this view that is perpetuated, and I think is still there, that the British were handed this responsibility, and somehow, and you get, sorry to say it, but again I think it reappears to a certain extent in the film, the idea that they were arbiters between two unruly groups of people, you know, the Zionists and the Palestinians, it's just, I shall have to watch my language, but it's not adequate as a description of the reality of what was taking place. In a political sense, or in an economic sense, because the mandate and the occupation and the consequences of Balfour were not just about a political view in terms of the character of the state of Palestine or the potential state of Palestine, but it had implications in a social and economic way as well. When the British went in to Palestine and occupied it, what they did was they actually used the Ottoman laws, as the earlier film were talking about, the alleged non-productivity of land or land left in abeyance for 3 to 7 years. The British used those kind of laws. They used the laws which had been changed in the Ottoman Empire in the 1860s when land laws were introduced, which gave the possibility of buying and selling land. Until this time, most land in Palestine was under Miri. The form of ownership was in a sense like a leasehold, you might say, that was handed down from family to family, although technically they didn't hold the land. But they changed it so that land could be bought and sold and become a commodity. And this was under various pressures from economic developments that were taking place in the 19th century. So what then happened is that people saw that the price of land was rising and that people were prepared to buy it. So land sales began. And they began, and this is notable, not by the Palestinians, but essentially by absentee landlords, most of whom actually lived in Lebanon. The Sursuks and other people were not Palestinians. It's a bit arbitrary because, of course, that's another story. But what is true is that the Palestinians did not sell their land in the first instance. In fact, it wasn't until the 1930s that some Palestinians sold their land, largely because of their indebtedness as a result of failed crops, the crash in the world economy in Wall Street in the late 1920s and so on. And that was when pressures began to build, so they had to look at, if you like, maintaining their families. The sale of lands which took place because of the absentee landlords, and that's seriously documented from under their feet. So what happened then was that those fellahin, the peasants and the farmers who worked on those lands, lost their livelihood, were displaced, and had to go looking for work, many of whom tried to get work in places like Haifa, in the docks, and in other parts of Palestine. Some succeeded in getting work in the railways. But what often happened is that they were in marginalized areas of occupation, in a precarious position, unlikely to be able to retain employment. So they were displaced from the land. On the other hand, they weren't able to gain jobs because what was happening simultaneously is that the settlers who come in under the ideology of Zionism, under the ideas of Zionism, implemented a policy called conquest of labor, which said essentially that Jewish employers should only take on Jewish workers. So whilst these Palestinians were being displaced from their land, went to look for work in the cities and the newly developing industrial areas, they were actually unable to get that work because they were precluded from actually doing so. So this was a big economic impact on, particularly, if you like, the agricultural workers and the young working class that was there. In addition, what the British did in respect of the industrial development was to give the monopoly, what were essentially monopoly industrial production, to pro-Zionist enterprises. So the Rutenberg electricity scheme, which was briefly referred to in the film, was a monopoly across Palestine, and even the local municipalities, which were considering other alternative options, were prevented from doing so. They were not able to be allowed to do that. So that, having a monopoly over electricity, you can see that that was an essential factor in the any economic development that might be possible. Similarly, in respect of the Dead Sea chemicals, we tend to think of it sometimes in relation to cosmetics and so on. No, it was about potash and bromine, absolutely critical resources in the agricultural field, which even today, from the Dead Sea, has a huge consequence. The World Bank produced a report, for example, in 20, get my years mixed up with the 100 years, in 2013, the World Bank produced a report which said that if the Dead Sea capacity of the chemical developments and resources in the Dead Sea were transferred to the Palestinians, it would increase the GDP of the Palestinian GDP by something like 14-15%. Massive, absolutely massive. Israel is making millions and millions of dollars out of exporting these chemicals. So is Jordan, for that matter. But essentially, the Palestinians even today are prevented from exploiting what is a major chemical resource that would be available to them to develop their economy. The same goes for quarries and for tourism and other areas. The World Bank report talked about a 38% deficit in the economy of Palestine as a result of what was happening on the West Bank. So these were issues that came with the mandate, which was handed to the British. This came with the issues that had social, economic, as well as political effects. This is what the Palestinians were up against, a colossal series of challenges that they faced. And the British occupation, if you like, went on and pursued that and carried that forward. I'll just conclude very briefly by saying that, in other words, what I think about the Balfour Declaration is, don't think of it as a declaration, think of it as a process which went on and on and on. And there was reference to the Palestinian uprising in 1936-39. I think that's another chapter in the history of the Palestinians which is neglected. It was not just, if you like, people fighting against the British. It was a mass uprising, general strikes, boycotts of Jewish goods, as to give it a shorthand version, we might say settler goods, really, would be more appropriate. And an uprising which took on the form of an armed struggle, which went on over a period of 3 years. In fact, there's some argument for saying that the British, when Chamberlain signed the deal with Hitler and waved the famous white paper, that one of the reasons he did the deal was in order to be able to ensure there were sufficient troops that could be directed to Palestine to suppress the revolt was taking place. A major revolt. And the Zionist forces were acting in consort, as the film does mention, with the British in order to suppress that and disarm the Palestinians. That's why when it came to 48, the Palestinians were really not in a position to fight back. Never mind what happened to the leadership, some of whom were exiled for a period of time, I think to the Seychelles, if I remember rightly. But there was a real disarming of the Palestinians that made it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to resist what came in 1948. And all of this built up as a consequence of the Balfour Declaration. So I think we ought to mark it in the proper way of objecting to it and opposing it. It was 67 words, but it's loaded, absolutely loaded with ambiguity. And it wasn't that the British were dealing with contradictions. Again, I'm sorry, but I disagree with the film about that. These were deliberate ambiguities introduced by the British into their promise to Zionism in order to legitimate British deciding what to do. And I think they were pragmatic about it. I don't think they had a vision of what they wanted to do from the outset. I think they were not calculating. I think they were just prepared to look at what was advantageous to them. And at the beginning they talked about, in fact, drawing a circle around Haifa and Accra, for example, as being British bases, in much the same way as you have Gibraltar and you have Aden as part of the chain to the empire. And they were kind of prepared to look at it. I think they were overtaken, and that's another longer story, by the way in which Zionism developed inside Palestine and the consequences of that. But we can see today, in Syria, the forces who are engaged in fighting are the French, the British, the Turks, the Arab peoples of the area, the Russians, and of course on the ground now, America. The only difference between now and then was that the Americans didn't have troops on the ground, but they did finance the British. The tragedy of Balfour continues.